Hello, and welcome to episode 41 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Nick Zoutra. On today's podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Michael Strevens, professor in the philosophy department at New York University. Michael's work is principally concerned with the nature of science, covering topics such as scientific explanation, understanding, complex systems, probability of various sorts, causation, and the social structure of science. He also applies contemporary research in cognitive psychology to explain aspects of both philosophical and scientific thinking. In his forthcoming book, Thinking Off Your Feet, How Empirical Psychology Vindicates Armchair Philosophy, Michael asks, what is going on under the hood in philosophical analysis? That familiar process that attempts to uncover the nature of such philosophically interesting kinds as knowledge, causation, and justice by the method of posit and counterexample. How in particular do intuitions tell us about philosophical reality? The standard, if unappealing, answer is that philosophical analysis is conceptual analysis. That is, that we learn about when we do philosophy, that what we learn about when we do philosophy is in the first instance facts about our own minds. Drawing on recent work on the psychology of concepts, this book proposes a new understanding of philosophical analysis, which he calls inductive analysis. The thesis that philosophical analysis is inductive analysis explains how novel, substantive philosophical knowledge can be generated in the armchair. It also explains why attempts at philosophical analysis tend to fall short of providing a complete and uncontroversial definition, and provides reasons not to lament this apparent shortcoming. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Michael. Well, Dr. Michael Strevens, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this afternoon?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Nick.
I'm both good to hear. I'm also doing well. How is it over in New York City?
It's a beautiful day. Here I am sitting inside, but at least the sunshine is coming in through the window of my office.
That's great.
Dappling my books.
Yeah. So you're currently teaching at New York University. Is that correct?
That's right.
Fantastic. How long have you been doing research and teaching there?
Well, I've been at NYU since 2004. So that's unfortunately that's a long time. 14 years. Yeah.
Right. So are you a true New Yorker now, as folks go? Yeah.
I was thinking I'm truly a mid-career philosopher now.
No longer early. Fantastic.
Not even close.
Yeah. Okay.
No, I graduated with my PhD in 1996, so that's more than 20 years ago.
Right. Yeah. So I guess it's about the time now of being into the mid stages of career. Cool.
Certainly.
Yeah. And I imagine you're not a native of New York, are you?
No, I'm from New Zealand, actually. I grew up in Auckland, New Zealand, and I came here to the US to study for the PhD, just down the road at Rutgers.
Oh, okay. Wow. So, we might as well start back in the story of New Zealand. So you grew up in Auckland.
That's right.
Fantastic. What were your parents up to at the time?
Well, my family business, which my father's father founded, was a small chain of lingerie stores, actually.
Really?
Yeah. People are always raising an eyebrow at that. For some reason, it doesn't. For some reason, philosophy and lingerie don't normally go together.
It is a business, and typically those. Yeah, but all right. So, sure.
It's not analytic philosophy, anyway.
Oh, sure. Okay, I imagine that was a source of business. Was the business good? Was it obviously owning a chain of stores? Did that work out well?
Well, they no longer exist. So I suppose the one-word answer is ultimately
no. Okay, sure.
But I think that was partly because none of my siblings or cousins were really so interested in running the business.
Yeah.
And so it was quietly, ultimately put to bed.
Mm-hmm. And did
for decades and decades, the women of Auckland were supplied by the Strevenses with their silly things.
Well, now the world has turned toward things like Amazon and online shopping and things, and so they're kind of the local source. It's not like folks aren't shopping for lingerie, but great. And was your mom involved in the work as well, or?
No, she did a string of different things in between child raising duties. So she was early on involved in the feminist movement, various aspects of that, as well as being a teacher who eventually herself became a university teacher. So she did a degree in theology and later in life lectured on church history.
Oh, wow, fascinating.
My parents are still alive, but they're both retired now and just happily whiling away the days, traveling around the world or hiking around New Zealand.
Okay, so they're still sort of based in New Zealand, but finding time to enjoy life. Well, that's good to hear. And you mentioned her involvement in the feminist movement. Was this local to New Zealand, or was this something sort of more of in a global way?
Well, it was. I mean, it was local in the sense that she was interested, involved in organizations and so on that were doing things in New Zealand. She was particularly involved in the kind of the academic end. At one point in her life, she did a degree in sociology as well, and so she was involved in an organization that was doing some social science research on women's lives. This was all during the 1970s. Yeah. So when I was just growing up.
Well, as I've studied and learned, the 70s were quite a big time in terms of the women's movement, and at least in the United States. I'm not sure how that has translated over to New Zealand, but
it was pretty similar. I think New Zealand is not the most avant-garde nation in the world, but it is mostly travels along in the wake of what's going on in the rest of the Western world, not too far behind.
Oh, great. Well, so, I just have to ask, what was it like growing up in Auckland? What kinds of things did you find yourself interested in?
Well, I think the answers to those two questions are completely different.
Okay, so, I just asked two questions, so let's go with the first one,
It was a pleasant place to grow up. I enjoyed it well enough, but I did feel like I was a little bit out of the action there.
Okay.
Auckland is not a small city by any means, but it is very far from pretty much everything else. Living in New York City these past 14 years or so is pretty much the exact opposite. In fact, I've been lucky enough to live in major cities in the U.S., or at least nearby for just about my entire career. Not entirely, but just about. And that was always something I wanted to end up doing when I was in New Zealand. I had the sense that the action was somewhere else, and that other place. But I enjoyed the idyllic New Zealand lifestyle well enough while I was waiting to become old enough to get on the plane.
So, in terms of the lifestyle, I mean, I noticed it still has a population of around, 1.25 million or a little bit over that. But, certainly.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. But in terms of the idyllic lifestyle, how do you say it would differ from this lifestyle in New York City?
It's a lot more like the West Coast. There's a lot more. Because it's not so bad for access to nature, but it's just such a huge metropolis. In New Zealand, it seems like you're never very far. Well, you are. You're in fact never very far from the beach. You're never very far from the mountains, or at least some kind of rugged topography, since almost the entire country is anything other than flat. Yeah. It feels more. The whole that whole landmass has only been settled by human beings for about 1,000 years. So it feels pretty raw, pretty new. Nature is everywhere, even growing up in the suburbs, where, to be honest, the nature was just well kept lawns and well tended gardens and so on.
Sure,
there's a kind of a feel to the place that is very much on the natural side as opposed to the artificial, cultured side.
Right. All right. So yeah, I'm starting to see some of the distinctions there, and kind of imagine what it might be like. And so, yeah, you mentioned the second question I had asked in terms of your interests. What did those look like growing up?
Well, they had nothing particularly to do with being in New Zealand. I was always very interested in the way the world worked, and so in science from a very early age. I was interested in pretty much everything else as well. But especially science. In fact, I started out really more than anything else wanting to go into the sciences as a researcher, so as an academic essentially. But then I was somewhat knocked off course when home computers came along.
Okay.
Around 1980 or so.
Oh,
I was about 15 then, and that was
pretty exciting. I can imagine.
Yeah. Well, those little boxes that we're so used to now, the sense that you could make them do these, what seemed to be at the time almost infinitely complicated and interesting and sophisticated things just by writing down some instructions was incredibly seductive. I feel like everybody of my generation who was interested in science got at least temporarily diverted into the fine art of computer programming if they had some kind of access to a machine. At my high school, we had a principal who was very interested in computing technology. So even though it was more expensive in New Zealand, so it was harder just to have a computer at home for most people. Of course, those were very early days anyway. But we had a good setup at school, and so I think I skipped more than a few classes to.
So what did you do on the computer? Yeah, what kinds of? How did you use it, or what?
I do. I wrote computer programs.
Okay.
The very first computer programs I wrote were actually even before the school got its computing set up, and they were written down on bits of futuristic-looking paper and sent off to a mainframe, and keyed into the mainframe. Then a couple of weeks later, we would get the results of our very simple computer programs, and to calculate the value of pi or something like that to a few decimal places. And that was we had to learn to wait. Yeah. And to actually get your hands on the thing, as I did a couple of years later, and have instant feedback was extraordinary. Huh. So I wasn't really playing games or anything like that. We didn't have much in the way of games to play. I was writing computer code to do almost anything that came into my head.
That's really exciting. And I imagine, what was the language you guys used?
Well, the whole string of languages. Those first programs that got sent away were in Fortran. Mm-hmm. Then the other two languages I would have used at high school were BASIC, which everyone was using at the time for these home computers, and Pascal, which was the language that designed for teaching programming that I was encouraged to use for most of my programming. So that's I don't know if you've run into it. The old it's a pretty standard procedural computer programming language like C or
I haven't used it, but I've heard about it. Have taken sort of learned of in taking programming courses, you kind of learn of the history of some of these languages and then how they kind of have developed over time. And so yeah. Well, cool. So in terms of derailment, was this like was there thought of doing programming as kind of a profession? Or going into some kind of software engineering or something, or was this more of a kind of like a hobby that was sort of distracting from the science?
It was somewhere in between.
Okay.
So on the one hand, I wasn't really so interested in being a software engineer or a systems analyst, as they said in those days.
Right.
But I did when I went on to college, to university. I basically started doing a computer science degree. I suppose what I vaguely had in the back of my mind is that I might become a computer science academic, but also at the same time I was doing mathematics and physics. And that was a good mix, but there was a point came very soon where I had to choose. So for some reason, the computer labs and the physics labs were timed at the same time, were scheduled at the same time. And both of them were compulsory for going on to major in those two subjects. And there was no way you could, and because of the way the courses were sequenced, there was no way you could put off one set of labs and do them the year after the other set of labs. So in effect, everyone had to decide. And there were a number of people in my situation, because as I said earlier, we'd all been had our hearts, or at least our minds, captured by this computing revolution. We just had to choose between going on to mainly do physics or mainly do computer science. And I chose, without really thinking about it, as far as I can remember, to stay with the computers.
Okay. And so where did you do your undergrad?
At the University of Auckland. Like all of my friends, this was the way it worked there. We graduated from high school, and then we just went to the local university and continued to live with our parents until we couldn't stand it anymore, or they couldn't stand it anymore.
Yeah. All right. Well, and then how was your time there, beginning in computer science and studying? What was it like?
Well, at first it was in a way it was a lot like high school, because I was still living with my parents.
Sure.
I was still sitting in front of a computer a lot. The kinds of things we were studying were a lot more interesting. The time, of course, was less structured, but my life didn't change as much as it would have if I'd gone off to college somewhere and been living in a dorm or something like that.
Sure.
It took a while for me to explore all those possibilities.
Yeah.
Well, actually, what happened was the New Zealand government decided, this was back in the days when it didn't actually cost anything to go to university. So I think I paid $50 a year in tuition.
$50, you said?
Yeah, which even in 1983 is not a lot of money. Yeah.
Wow.
But once you reach the age of 20, the New Zealand government decided that was too infra-dig for you to continue living at home, and so they would start paying you a living allowance as well, so you could actually leave. So around that time, like many of my friends,
that's great. Yeah.
I took off.
So did you? I imagine, moved out, lived relatively close to the university. Yeah.
Exactly.
Nice. All right.
And then started rethinking the whole trajectory I'd taken. So this is a story I've heard from a lot of people who ended up in philosophy. So I'm far from being the only one, and I think philosophy of science in particular. But among the other classes I did as I worked my way on in computer science and mathematics was a logic class, a formal logic class that was taught by somebody actually in the philosophy department.
Yeah. So
and when I did that, there was something intriguing and exciting about formal logic, in much the same way there was something intriguing and exciting about computer programming, and it was a little bit like a new love.
So well, if you could, put it into sort of communicable words, what was it about the excitement of formal logic? I've heard also folks who share interest in computer science are, even in my own home university, we have like a logic seminar that I think has both folks attending, both from the computer science departments and from, I would say, mathematics and philosophy. But what was it about formal logic that excited you?
I think it's closely connected to the computer thing. A lot of what was really exciting about computer programming was making a computer do something that was sophisticated. Yeah. In an intellectual sense. And what was exciting about formal logic was the idea that you could formalize, or at least the promise. Well, in both cases, these were promises that were not wholly delivered. In formal logic, the promise that you could formalize abstract thought, abstract, sophisticated, intelligent thought, write down the rules of thought, and and investigate their properties using mathematical techniques, or for that matter, by going back to computers and turning some of those rules into algorithms.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so, with this course, what was there any particular questions or anything else that kind of excited you that you said, oh, this is something I want to study more, or this is something I want to do? What were your thoughts?
I think the class, along with also a theoretical computer science class. So theoretical computer science includes a bunch of stuff that philosophy PhDs also typically study in doing their logic requirements, the topics of computability and decidability and so on.
Yeah.
Doing that class and the logic class made me realize I really had a taste for abstraction, maximal abstraction. And second, that I was really interested in thinking about how thought worked. So not just in thinking about how the world worked, but understanding the mind as well as the world.
And in what ways do you think, this is more general, that, or at least at the time, that thinking about how thought worked from an approach to formal logic would be beneficial or insightful as opposed to other ways of thinking about thought?
Well, I think it turns out that formalizing logic only tells you so much about thought, right? Most of the interesting stuff is not there in the at least in the logics that we know best. Mm-hmm. When philosophers realized this in I suppose roughly the second half of the 20th century, they became more interested in formalizing other kinds of thought other than, say, just deductive logic. Sure. Such as causal reasoning, for example. Mm-hmm. But those formal systems, on the whole, were not incredibly successful. It's turned out that the most of the progress we've made in understanding causal reasoning comes through writing computer programs that do causal reasoning, not in creating axiomatic systems. Right. Although in some sense, of course, you can turn any computer program into an axiomatic system, but that seems, I think, somewhat beside the point. Sure. So I'm thinking of for example, the kind of work that some of the philosophers at Carnegie Mellon have done on causal discovery, and the kind of work that Judea Pearl has done, which has blossomed into this interventionist way of thinking about causation, but essentially in automating causal reasoning. There's a lot of sophistication in those systems, but it's not sophistication that ultimately formal logic, as we philosophers know it and love it, is particularly helpful with. So it was a stepping stone. For me, and I don't. It's been ages since I did anything that was really connected to formal logic. Interested though I am in various forms of reasoning. It was great at the time. But although I still spend quite a bit of time thinking about thought and how the mind works, how the scientific mind works, also just how the regular everyday mind works. It's not in formal logical terms at all.
Yeah. All right. So, was it at this point that I guess your interests and or sort of a discipline switch was afoot, or? Yes.
So various things happened to me at that point. I went through most of the experiences that people do when they're roughly that age, when they go away to college and so on, that are life-altering in various ways. Intellectually, though, I managed just in time to hang on to a certain kind of intellectual continuity, and ended up in philosophy, doing some classes in logic. It helped actually that the chair of the philosophy department. This was in those days, the departments were organized on a old-fashioned model where the chair of the department, the head of the department, was also one or maybe the major professor in the department.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, the head at that time was Krista Segerberg, who's a Swedish formal logician.
Mm-hmm.
And he kind of took me under his wing and said, "Okay, you love logic. That's great. I'll teach you more logic. And if you're interested in philosophy more generally, do some more philosophy classes." And in effect, in a year, I did a kind of a selection of philosophy classes, hardly enough to constitute what a philosophy major, even by the laxest standards.
Sure.
Enough to give me quite a good sense of what philosophy is all about. And when I started writing philosophy papers, then I realized I'd figured out what I really wanted to do with my life.
Oh, wow.
Not just the logic stuff, but just writing generally about, pretty much all the things that philosophers think about.
Yeah, how the world, in a sense, how the world works, how the mind works, how people think. Yeah. Oh, great.
Yeah, and I was interested, and I was also pretty interested in ethical and political philosophy.
Uh-huh.
That whole way of posing questions at a certain level of abstraction and at a certain foundational level was really exciting to me. Mm-hmm. Like a lot of people, I'd kind of known what philosophy was about, but I hadn't had enough experience close up to have a good sense of what it would be like to actually do philosophy.
Yeah,
it was only in a way partly partly having run through my other options and looking at, and I was just about out of time, as it were, to be an undergraduate. I had piled up enough classes. In the end, I ended up with 2 undergraduate degrees, but that was, which was only 5 years of study actually in the New Zealand system. But still, that was pretty much maxing it out. So I was gonna be done, and I just managed to cram in enough philosophy at the very end to discover that was the style of thought that I thought I could spend decades romping around in, and that's something that I find both exciting and meaningful in a way that even when I was most deeply into computer programming, it was so distracting, but never seemed like the thing I ultimately wanted to do.
Yeah. I can relate. I can relate to those feelings. What are there any significant differences between the New Zealand school system and the U.S. system?
You mean
were there
high school or
I'm sorry, university system?
Well, the main difference is the degrees were shorter. So it's like the U.S. system in the sense that there's some specialization, but not the kind of extreme specialization that you get in some systems where you just name your topic when you enter university and then that's your thing.
Sure.
So it was a little bit more like the liberal arts idea. Not quite as liberal as the U.S. system, but still leaning in that direction. But the degrees were only 3 years long, so it gives you somewhat less time to explore. Otherwise, I would say it's pretty similar.
Okay. I can see. I hadn't spoken with anyone who had done a degree in New Zealand, so this was it's informative to know if there are any differences in the U.S. I've spoken to a few Australians. Obviously, there's some pretty strong differences there. But yeah, just was curious to see.
I think the Australian system was pretty similar to the New Zealand system at the time I was going through it, but things have certainly changed. And I'm not totally clear on what the changes are.
Something's different. Okay. Were you, involved with anything particularly New Zealand centric, like political campaigns or anything, or just was there anything about that at the time, or was it?
No, I didn't so much take advantage of the fact I was in New Zealand as opposed to some other similar place.
Okay.
One thing I did get involved in quite a bit at that time was debating as a sport or as a competitive activity.
Yeah. Did you do debate in college?
Yeah, so that was more, in New Zealand, it was more like the British style, so less fact-oriented and more a matter of spinning a persuasive line.
Uh-huh. Great. Well, that's...
It was it was more freewheeling. There was very little research involved. A lot of it was kind of thinking on your feet and being clever, not necessarily in a nice way.
Wow. Okay, so like in going about a particular debate, so I've never done speech and debate, but I've heard that in terms of a debate, it can be months of preparation for a particular topic. So, what was the preparation like for, let's say, a debate?
We would do more like minutes of preparation.
Wow! Oh, that's exciting.
Sometimes it was set up that way. A lot of it, you would have something like 5 minutes or 10 minutes to prepare.
Mm-hmm.
So it was sometimes you'd have a little bit longer than that, more like several hours. But it was, as I say, there was little research involved. It was mostly strategizing and then implementing the strategy with by using your persuasive and other rhetorical skills.
Yeah. I imagine, has this been something that you have had to, has facilitated your philosophical writing, or has it also been something you had to unlearn in some ways?
A little bit of both, I think.
Yeah. Great. All right. So at this point, it sounds like you made the shift and the move to the U.S. to study philosophy. Is that right?
That's not quite right, actually.
Oh, okay.
So I had at this point, I think I'd done a grand total of 4 classes in philosophy.
Oh, gotcha.
Which seemed to me to be not enough preparation for the PhD.
Right.
I don't know. Looking back, maybe it would have been, but in the right place.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that in the end I ended up doing a master's degree in New Zealand in philosophy and learned a lot more philosophy in that time, not just doing in classes, but also talking to my advisors outside of classes and just getting a sense for the whole philosophical landscape.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to remember. I think before, in that undergraduate period, in fact, it may have only been 3 classes, not counting logic, or maybe 4. Maybe there's a philosophy of science class. There are a couple of, anyway, not very
a few
much
classes,
and a bunch of it was essentially history of philosophy.
Yeah.
So I didn't have much of a sense of what was going on in contemporary philosophy at all until I did that master's degree. So that was very useful. And of course, I felt like I still had infinite amounts of time and to study, so I wasn't in any particular hurry.
Absolutely.
And so I did that degree, and then after that, I came to the US to do the PhD. I also, in that time, did the thing that all New Zealanders do, which is go off and travel around the world with a backpack and just take an opportunity to get out there. New Zealand is so far from everything else. Really, the only places within a few hours flight are the closer parts of Australia and some Pacific islands. So to visit any continent other than Australia, or I suppose, come to think of it, Antarctica, is a major undertaking. And in those days, especially, it's become a little bit more affordable. But in those days, it was a big investment. So to go, say, to Europe was a huge deal. So people would still take a whole year off from college or whatever they're doing, and go and spend 6 months or maybe even a year traveling around, and that would be the big trip. We really got to see the rest of the world, which otherwise was just so hard to access.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I mean, so, I imagine U.S. centric or European centered folks, I mean, they make travels, but there perhaps is not as much of a push to do the round the world or to go from continent to continent, just perhaps because of the experience of feeling, I guess, more connected to one's place, or not even one's place, but just the rest of different parts of the world.
Yeah, well, living here, say it's quite a bit easier to get. Obviously, it's very easy to get to North America, and somewhat easier to get to South America, and to Europe, and so on. You feel like you can go for a week or two, and it's no big deal. But from New Zealand, it's a more major undertaking.
Yeah. Was there a particular continent or area, countries with which New Zealanders would often visit, or which you were interested in visiting?
Well, I think typically Europe was at the top of the list for a lot of people to see. Where New Zealand, we'd grown up in a culture that was largely Western European and more particularly largely Anglo. So most New Zealanders in those days had a lot of UK ancestry, and certainly that set the tenor of the culture. So that was where, even if it wasn't where you came from, I mean, in my case, it was where it came from, but even if it wasn't where you came from, it was where the whole milieu that you grew up in came from. And so you wanted to go and see what it was all about.
Yeah.
So typical. One thing people would often do is go and live in London for 6 months, working in a bar or something like that as a bartender.
Oh, yeah,
and then save up money and make trips to other parts of Europe, or I guess now I should just say to Europe. Week in Paris here, or a couple of weeks exploring Italy there, and do it that way. So it was pretty Eurocentric for a lot of people.
Okay.
I think that's slowly changed. People have become more interested in Asia. New Zealand itself has many more Asians living in it than were living there when I was growing up. So a lot more immigrants from really all parts of Asia, South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia.
Oh, I didn't. I mean, I know it's relatively, closer in relation to other continents. I actually don't know the particular demographics of the New Zealanders. Would you? Most are probably native, and then, I guess, is it primarily mostly Asia, more Asian, more Western European?
You mean, well, in terms of the ethnic makeup now, it's still mostly people with European backgrounds, just in terms of sheer numbers, but it's changed a lot since I was growing up there.
Okay.
It's much more, Auckland certainly feels a lot more cosmopolitan.
Right.
So there's just more, and that part of the world has also emerged. And when I was a kid, a little kid, Japan was still catching up.
Yeah.
It was that long ago, let alone China and the rest of Asia. So people's eyes were still more back on Europe and to some extent North America.
Sure.
I spent that whole period in North America and Europe myself.
Oh, okay.
So I didn't go any further afield than that. I've been brought up reading English novels.
Yeah.
Learning Latin and reading the classics, Latin classics, and so on. And my first impulse was to go and see where all of that came from.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So following some, I imagine. So in North America, was that mostly like the East Coast? Some of the.
No, it was all over the place. Actually, I met up with a friend who was going off to business school in the U.S. and we met up here actually in New York City, and we perhaps unwisely bought this enormous early 1970s era convertible.
Oh, really?
Which we then just took on a grand tour of all of well, not all, of course, but of large swaths of the US and Canada.
That sounds like a blast.
Yeah, we didn't take it into Mexico. Maybe that was wise. There was at one point we had to do a sojourn in Mississippi while a local mechanic put the engine back together. It was never quite the same afterward, but it was quite a splendid vehicle in its own way.
What a place to get stopped in Mississippi. Yeah. All right. Well, all right. So after some fun traveling, what in terms of getting into the philosophy at Rutgers, what a place to get into it. Yeah. What kinds of stuff did you do at Rutgers?
So when I got to Rutgers, this was 1991. It was still an up and coming place.
Okay.
It wasn't one of the old established, fancy graduate programs, but they had just hired a lot of excellent faculty, and many of those faculty were working in areas in the philosophy of mind or cognitive science or areas connected to those topics. So that was what was most exciting when I got to Rutgers, what was generating a lot of the excitement. I mean, there was a big faculty and there were excellent people in all areas, but with people like Jerry Fodor and Steve Stitch and Colin McGinn there, it was the philosophy of mind seemed to be where the Rutgers action anyway, most of all was. Of course, I ultimately came out of there as a philosopher of science, and with me came a bunch of really good philosophers of science. So there was something a little broader going on there, which is a kind of, I suppose you might say, a kind of empirical state of mind, which I think still characterizes the place, even though it's changed a lot since I was there. So there was more specifically, there was this sense of the philosophy of mind, which was very much in those days about how the mind worked and its relevance for the rest of philosophy. There was that, and then just a broader sense that although we were philosophers and we were entitled to spend some quality time in our armchairs, nevertheless, it was important and very, very interesting and rewarding to be plugged into the world at large.
Yeah.
Which meant mainly the world as science was revealing it to be.
Right.
So that was the scene that I landed in, and that very much suited my taste, what I was interested in at the time.
So who are you?
So it was a great place to be.
Yeah. So who are you working with?
Well, I experimented with various projects while I was there. Maybe I should just, if I tell you about the projects.
Yeah, that might be more. Yeah.
You'll have a sense of who I was working with. So on the one hand, I'd become very interested when I was in New Zealand doing that master's degree in teleosemantics. So the Ruth Millikan style way of thinking about mental representation, the question of mental representation generally. I was interested in continuing to work on that. And there are a bunch of people there who are interested in these issues. That was around the time when Jerry Fodor was I guess had just finished producing his theory of content. So that got talked about a lot. He was an obvious person to work with, but he wasn't so great at getting into other people's projects and seeing them from their points of view. So he's a great person to bounce ideas off up to a point. But in the end, I didn't end up working with him in the full sense of the word with.
Right.
I did a lot of one of my early mentors there was Steve Stitch. I spent a lot of time talking to him, and at one point we were working on a project together, which turned out to be something he's done a lot of work on since, which is the relevance of the findings of cognitive science for philosophical methodology generally. He's a bit of a skeptic, as you may know. He thinks the more you look into how the mind really works, the less what philosophers do looks like a good way of finding out anything, of answering any questions. So he's very much the patron saint of what people sometimes call the negative school of experimental philosophy.
Yeah.
My friend Edouard Machery, who didn't himself get his PhD at Rutgers, but who spent quite a bit of time there. Around at when he was just coming out. His new book on this topic is the latest salvo of the negative experimental program directed against armchair philosophy.
I happened to be in the audience witnessing the author meets critics actually this past spring, and I get to see, and I'm interested. I'm interested to
that. So you were there when I was commenting on his.
Exactly. No, I was very impressed by your comment and your charitable understanding and appreciation for Edwards, and then your own book, which I'm interested to hear more, or the upcoming book of Philosophy Unbound. Is it called? Or maybe not, or maybe that was the idea behind it. Or
yeah, that's right. That was the idea. It's the title is going to be. This is coming out at the end of this year. So this is the realization, I should say, of that project that I was.
Oh, really? Okay.
I wrote a couple of chapters of a possible thesis on this topic when I was in graduate school. So this is
25 years later, those chapters. So oh wow, okay, that's exciting.
I mean, it certainly came out a little differently, but it's essentially that project which I've been working on in secret ever since, sporadically. That constitutes this book, which is going to be called "Thinking Off Your Feet."
That's right. I'm sorry. Yeah.
The subtitle is tells you what it's all about, and you'll see it's a direct riposte to the negative experimental philosophers. It's called Actually, what is it called? Just a second while I consult my memory.
No problem.
How Empirical Psychology Vindicates Armchair Philosophy.
Oh.
So it's in the spirit of the Steve Stitch School of Philosophy that very much my thought is we need to understand the psychology of philosophy in order to get a grip on the reliability or otherwise of armchair philosophy. So I'm an empiricist in that respect, but I end up with a far more favorable conclusion than Edouard does in his book.
Right. And so you mentioned that this particular project is from some of the work going on during your graduate work. So what kinds of chapters, what did you work on, and was this your thesis for your graduate work?
This project?
Yeah.
No. I in the end moved. I decided I wasn't quite ready to write on that topic, which I guess was correct. The fact that it took me 20 years to finish as any sign. That would have broken some records for time to degree.
That's right.
And so I ended up involved in a completely different project, having to do with probabilities and complexity. So I was always, as you know, I was always interested in science, and therefore I was always interested in philosophy of science. But I had been swept away by these questions about how the mind works.
Yeah.
I got interested in Ruth Millikan's teleosemantics. Writing about that had got me interested in how explanation works in evolutionary biology, since really it's the power of explanation evolutionary biology is being harnessed to give a sophisticated account of mental content in heliosemantics. And in fact, the intentionality of content, the subtle and sophisticated differences that there can be in semantic differences between two mental states that are reaching out towards more or less similar parts of the world. Those, if those are going to be reproduced by a Millikan-style semantics, you have to be able to find the same kind of subtle distinctions in explanation. It's got to be that there's a slightly different evolutionary explanation over here founds a slightly different content for the mental state, at least roughly speaking. So this really put a spotlight when I was working on this on the mechanics of explanation and the question whether explanation is capable of making these fine distinctions.
Yeah, yeah.
And at first I was skeptical, but then I became, I got, in the course of constructing an argument that it can't be done, I started getting excited about some ideas about how, in fact, it might be done.
Oh.
So I was interested on the side in the nature of explanation in evolutionary biology and, in science generally, consequently. And I brought that interest with me when I came to Rutgers, but it was still on the side. But in the time I was there, I continued to think about it, partly because I was still thinking about this mental representation stuff.
Yeah.
And it turned out that in turn, the fine distinctions that you want to make in explanation require some fine distinctions in, shall I say, probabilification, and exactly what raises the probability of what, or lowers the probability of what. Okay, These are going to find their way into facts about explanatory relevance, which will then find their way into facts about mental content. So I ended up getting interested in the foundations of probability for this reason.
Wow.
And what I ended up writing my thesis on was some of these questions about the foundations of probability. So, like a typical philosopher, every time I had a topic, I would start worrying about the foundational assumptions that brought in the course of that topic, and following them back to some more foundational topic. And I found myself being a philosopher of science, and a philosopher of probability more specifically.
Really? All right. So what kinds of conclusions or claims did you reach in terms of foundations of probability?
Well, I was above all interested in probability and complex systems.
Right.
And just for the reasons you would think, given everything I've said, I was interested in the way probability worked in, say, an ecosystem.
Yeah, yeah.
So I wasn't so interested in say the probabilities that turn up in quantum mechanics.
Right,
That was not so much my project. I was more interested in the probabilities that turn up in statistical mechanics, the part of physics that deals with that deals with certain kinds of complex systems and deals with them statistically by hypothesizing, or at least describing probabilities to various motions and so on of the particles involved in the system. So I was building on discussions that already existed about statistical mechanics. Many of those discussions started out with the idea that statistical mechanics, statistical physics would still make sense even if physics turned out to be wholly at bottom deterministic. Okay, so even if there were no fundamental irreducible probabilities, even if it was all just as Newton thought, it was just initial conditions and deterministic laws. Mm-hmm. Everything that happens can be derived from initial conditions and the deterministic laws. It would still make sense. It would still work when you're dealing with these complex systems, which in statistical physics, in some ways, are not that complex. They can just be something like a gas. So complex in the sense that you have innumerable numbers of particles flying around, but none of the particles is doing anything very complicated. They're just bouncing off the walls and bouncing off each other.
Sure.
That's about it, pretty much. The complexity comes just through the combinatorial explosion.
Gotcha.
That you get. You could never sit down and write down the mathematics of a system like that. That even a small amount of gas contains something like 10 to the 26 molecules of gas. So instead, you put a probability distribution over what the particles are doing, and say, okay, here's the probability distribution over a typical gas molecule's velocity. Here's the probability distribution over the typical gas molecule's position, and then you can draw conclusions, of course, not about individual molecules, or at least not very interesting conclusions about individual molecules, but about the behavior of the system in the aggregate. And you can draw some, as the first statistical physicists in the late 19th century, like James Clerk Maxwell found, you can draw some pretty interesting conclusions, even some startling predictions, which turned out to be correct, about the behavior of gases in the aggregate from these ascriptions of probability. So the thought is that this would work even if we lived in a deterministic world.
Yeah.
So here's a practice of ascribing probabilities to things that gives you good predictions of certain things, and also it seems, as best anyone can tell, good explanations. But that must be founded somehow ultimately in deterministic laws and particular initial conditions. So the foundational problem is to say how, what is it about a system like that makes this whole statistical practice work? And that was the question I ended up posing in this dissertation project. But I was ambitious enough to want to pose the question. No, I did not completely answer it. Yeah. Needless to say, I suppose. I even wanted to pose it with something like an ecosystem, where instead of molecules, well, you do have molecules, of course, but the bits that are running around that have the probabilities ascribed to them are organisms. Yeah. And what you're looking at are things like a probability distribution that gives you the expected number of offspring for some particular organism, or a probability distribution that gives you, given various other parameters, how likely some particular organism is to get eaten in a certain period of time. These kinds of probabilities that find their way into the models that both population ecologists build, but also evolutionary biologists when they're thinking about the consequences of fitness. So that was a big thing to take on. Yeah, that's a very ambitious project, and wow. And so, did this amount to a paper or two, or how did this? The whole thing ultimately turned into a book. Okay, so was this bigger than Chaos? Understanding. That's exactly right. Yeah. Great. So that book came out. Let me see, in 2003. So that was 7 years after I finished my thesis. There was a lot of work in the intermediate period and in writing that book, and I really the thesis was a good start. I'll put it that way. But the thought in the book is these statistical practices work above all because it's okay to make certain kinds of independence assumptions and say, the probabilities are not going to be affected by these factors or these factors or these factors. Yet often those factors do play a causal role in the things you're ascribing the probability to. Yeah. So you're saying, in one of these classical statistical mechanics derivations, for example, these are the simplest cases to talk about. You're saying the probability that a molecule kind of comes in from this direction rather than this direction when it hits my target molecule is independent of anything my target molecule has done in the past. Yeah. Okay. But it's not causally independent because those molecules have been bouncing around together and influencing one another for perhaps, certainly for long enough that they've probably, if not directly collided, certainly had a long tangled causal history together. So it seems that what you need to be able to do in order to justify these practices is to find circumstances in which it's okay to say that you have statistical independence, even though you don't have causal independence. And a lot of the book is about why it might be the case that sometimes you can, and what the circumstances are under which you can have statistical independence without causal independence. That makes sense. So you can say, even though these things have interacted in the past, it's okay to assign them probabilities that don't take into account
some of the interactions,
some of these factors that have played a role in the causal history. So we can in effect ignore a lot of the causal complexity of these systems.
Yeah.
When we go statistical. Well, I should say, when we go statistical, we do ignore a lot of the complexity.
Right, and that's just okay.
My route to figuring out why it's okay is to figure out why it's okay to ascribe probability distributions that have these formal independence properties.
Yeah.
So it turns into quite a mathematical investigation at a very abstract level, at a level that has some purchase both on systems of gas molecules flying around and also on systems of animals scampering around, eating one another, and so on.
Yeah. So I haven't read the book, but it sounds fascinating. I've been interested in complex systems. Now, in the terms of if you're describing complex systems, do you mean to refer to all complex systems? In the sense that when a system is described as being complex, is that more of a mathematical description of it, or is there? I mean, can your your claim and your way of describing things essentially be applied in any and all cases?
Yeah, I'm not thinking of every system that can be called complex. I'm just thinking of the kinds of complex systems where this kind of statistical thinking turns out to work. And typically, these are systems where you have many components, molecules, organisms, whatever, that are moving around somewhat independently, but also interacting quite often. So think of a gas molecule is colliding very frequently with the walls and other gas molecules in a container, but in between it just sort of flies through space, relatively uninfluenced by whatever else is going on. And likewise, that's what's happening with organisms going around an ecosystem. Often they interact, and in between they're just doing their own thing. And that obviously is not a formal philosophical definition by any means. I'm just trying to characterize the sorts of systems that my treatment applies to. So you have a lot of many somewhat independent yet strongly interacting parts is how I sum it up in a few words.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But the aim is not to turn that into a formal definition, but rather to figure out why, for a specific set of systems that I can point to, these kinds of treatments work.
Yeah. All right. Great. And how was the book received?
A lot of people were confused.
Sure. It's a pretty high level topic. Where do you think that confusion came from?
I think it wasn't obvious. The official aim of the book is to understand why these techniques work. The way I put it in the book itself was to understand why, was even at one level of remove, to understand why these kinds of complex systems often behave in simple ways.
Yeah.
Where the simple ways are the ways that are predicted by the statistical models.
Yeah.
So in the first few pages, really, I say, well, it's the route to understanding why they behave in simple ways is to understand why these statistical models work.
Yeah.
And then it becomes the foundational questions we've just been discussing. But I'm not sure. I think a number of readers were somewhat inclined to ignore all of that side of the project and just to read the whole thing as an exercise in discussing the foundations of probability.
Oh.
and so less interested in or attentive to my attempts to explain why in particular kinds of systems you would get statistical independence even though you don't have causal independence. Try to understand the project as being perhaps broader in some ways, as being a foundation for all probability.
Oh, sure.
Or as making claims that are not limited to particular classes or kinds of systems, claims that are somehow necessarily true. I think they were looking more for proofs from first principles than for consequences of properties of particular systems. But I had hoped that regardless of whether people thought I'd solved the problem, they would at least think it was a really good problem.
Yeah.
And I didn't think the problem was really caught on.
Yeah.
In the way I hoped. There are people dotted around the world who are really interested in these questions. For example, the kind of people who gravitate to the Santa Fe Complexity Institute.
Yeah.
But among philosophers, there's been relatively little interest. I don't know why. It seems like such a good question for philosophers to think about. It's so broad.
Yeah.
So difficult.
Yeah. It's an interesting sociological question, I suppose.
Yeah. By the way, if anyone is interested in this stuff, then I would suggest the book itself, which is a lot of pages, but a paper I wrote called "How Are the Sciences of Complex Systems Possible," which gives a kind of an overview of what I'm up to in the book and the way some of the most important arguments work. Maybe calling them arguments is exactly the kind of thing that gets me into trouble. They're not so much arguments as derivations or demonstrations that when you have certain kinds of properties in a system, you'll have the opportunity to ascribe probability distributions that have these independence properties.
Yeah.
Anyway, so listeners, if you're interested, take a look at that article. That's that's something that goes in deeply enough. You can really see what I'm up to, but can be easily consumed in one sitting.
Yeah, in a sense, it's a philosophy of complex systems, or a philosophy of science, the philosophy of the science of complex systems. Yeah.
That's right. Well, a certain kind of important class of behaviors of a certain important class of complex systems.
Right. Very nice.
And I should also say that paper is pretty much I do everything in pictures rather than in mathematics.
Okay. Well, that's good. Yeah. That could always be a hurdle, I can imagine, for some budding philosophers. If the math is pretty high level.
Well, the mathematics is just hard for anyone to read.
Yeah.
We have natural language comprehension is built in, but mathematics comprehension always takes work.
Yeah. So you had finished this, and just to sort of catch us up, after your time at Rutgers, well, in terms of sort of work and teaching and research, what was the timeline? What events transpired?
Well, professionally, what happened is after I graduated, I spent a year at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa, and then I moved on to Stanford University.
Oh, how was it? Okay, well, so I imagine just a quick, being placed at Iowa State, and then I imagine a job opened up at Stanford.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, then, so how was your time at Stanford?
It was that was a department that was very congenial. It had that same, or at least for many people there, that same empirical orientation. At least, I shouldn't say the whole department was like that. I enjoyed my time there. I liked the people there a lot, and there were a group of us who were very empirically inclined. In particular, my colleague Peter Godfrey Smith, who was there at the time.
The
philosopher of science there's someone who started out early on thinking about teleosemantics and got interested in biology, but ended up becoming a philosopher of biology rather than a philosopher of probability as a result. And we had many students, PhD students, came through who are interested in philosophy of science, ended up going into the field.
Oh yeah,
it was a great place to be for those reasons.
Oh, great. And so I imagine it was during your time at Stanford that you really worked on this book.
That's right.
Great.
That's right.
Great. And so from Stanford, then I imagine I'm just looking at your CV here, teaching there for quite a while, and then what prompted the shift? How did you come across transitioning to NYU?
Well, the reason I ended up coming, the reason I left Stanford was I actually was denied tenure there.
Really?
Yeah, so that gives you some sense of when you asked how the book was received.
That's tough, man. That's really disappointing.
But then I was offered a tenured job at NYU, so that wasn't so bad.
And then it worked out. Jeez. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing about what I imagine was a pretty disappointing event. Yeah.
Especially since, as I say, I was having a great time there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. Would you mind, I don't know, sharing a little bit about this briefly about, that your experience with that?
Well, I know less about it than some people. I know that some people were in favor, some people were against. And that was too much of a split vote for the thing to happen.
And I imagine, with a place like Stanford, I can only imagine it's a bit more stringent of a sort of approval process.
That's right. They didn't like the idea of somebody about whom any doubts could be raised.
Ah, geez.
So it was a fairly conservative process.
Okay.
I don't know that if it was somewhat less conservative, maybe the same thing would have happened. But
sure. Well, yeah, you're right. And if there's a split, there's not much, I guess, you can do. But I suppose it has
Yeah, you don't get to defend yourself. You can't.
You just hear the answer.
That's not a very good argument. No, what I said doesn't have that implication because.
Right. Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, apparently the number one program thought you were the best, or thought you were worthwhile to hire for the tenure. Okay, so so what was that like? I guess transitioning over, post sort of having to, I guess, in terms of being denied, is it sort of a process of starting over, or just kind of continuing your work? What happens?
Yeah, no, there was very little discontinuity. Right? Just, of course, that year was something of a mess.
Yeah.
Then I just moved here and continued with my work, and
did you find it? Was it
started enjoying New York City?
Yeah.
There was no. Yeah, I don't suppose it really. It's a good question. Did that actually make a difference to my work? I was somewhat chastened. Yeah, but I don't know that it really made a difference to the topics I was interested in, or the basic techniques and methods I used to tackle those topics.
Yeah. Okay.
I realized obviously a lot of people had not understood and appreciated what I was up to. The frustrating thing about the process is you don't really know why.
Yeah.
Put your finger on what went wrong.
I can. Yeah. Well, especially when you're doing what seems to be right. You're publishing, in the top journals. You're, you're doing everything, and even if a book is, I don't know. I can only speculate. But that's difficult. I guess I'm curious about. So I imagine though the work, that obviously a change happened. So the content of your work, but was I suppose that was there some motivation to do things differently, I suppose, or I don't know, or just kind of keep, or what was your, if you were to reflect on that?
I don't know. As I said before, I don't think not that much changed.
Okay.
Maybe I gave more thought to not gratuitously annoying people. But maybe not enough. I don't know.
Okay. All right. So,
the kind of thing we advise our graduate students about, when you send a paper to a journal, make sure you cite everyone who's a referee for the paper.
Right.
Those kinds of thoughts crossed my mind, but
sure.
But I continued on, and My next big
What was the next? What was the next project?
So of course the book by then had come out, so it had been some time since I'd actually been actively working on it philosophically. The next big project was the project on explanation, which was supposed to, of course, this whole story about probability was supposed to make the story about explanation possible.
Yeah.
So I got I was writing a lot about explanation, and that resulted in some papers, and ultimately my next book also about my next book, which was about explanation.
Yeah, and this was
explanation of science.
Yeah, depth and account of scientific explanation.
And the culmination of that is really understanding these kinds of understanding why it would be explanatory in a deterministic world to ascribe probabilities to things. So why something like statistical mechanics is explanatory, even if the underlying processes are deterministic, or why evolutionary biology.
Yeah, what does it do at all? Yeah.
What these probabilities are doing for us in an explanatory way.
Yeah.
I also got interested. Meanwhile, I was getting interested in a bunch of different things. Maybe the most important of which was the social structure of science.
What about the social structure of science interests you?
Well, I've been these days all sorts of things. Like a classic philosopher of science, I'm interested in the aspects of the social structure that have epistemological implications.
Yeah.
That somehow play a role in the success of science. But the success broadly construed, so not just in convergence on the truth and such like, but maybe I should just tell you how I got into this topic in the first place.
Yeah, that'd be great.
It was reading Philip Kitch's work on the division of cognitive labor and teaching that work. Actually, I started to have some thoughts about how it might be extended and made more general. And in particular, that took me into reading about the reward system in science, the way that scientists get credit for their discoveries, achievements, and so on, and various aspects of the reward system. And my work was trying to connect thoughts about the reward system, was following in Kitch's heels in this way, thoughts about the reward system with thoughts about the efficient division of cognitive labor and showing how they work together so that the reward system would encourage the efficient distribution of labor. The efficient here meaning scientists going to work on using methods or going to work on projects that look like they'll give the greatest payback for the effort invested. So which is, the reason it's a tricky issue is that as a scientist, say, coming out, or maybe even deciding where to go and do your PhD, or more exactly whose lab to go and work in to do your PhD, you're thinking to yourself, well, what are the growth areas in my discipline? What kind of methods look like they're going to be successful? But also, who else is going into those areas and using those methods? Maybe I'm better off going into a somewhat less beaten path and being the authority in those methods or that technique or those questions. how do you make these questions? It's a real kind of weighing of various various probabilities. You do your best, of course. Of course, you're never going to know as much as you would like to know.
Yeah.
Making these decisions, but at the same time, it's important to take into account some specific features of the scientific reward system. In particular, the thing that got me in the end was the feature of the system that says that only the first person to make a discovery gets credit for that discovery.
Right.
So you've always got to be thinking, assuming that you care about credit, you've always got to be thinking not just where can I do valuable work, but where can I do work that at the time is going to be uniquely valuable in the sense that I'm going to be the first person to have solved these problems or successfully applied these techniques or discovered the structure of this or the cause of that. And so the work I did was connecting, in particular, this concern for priority, for being not just for doing valuable work, but for being the first, showing how that might actually alter scientists' decisions in certain subtle ways that mean that the things they end up working on make for a better, a more efficient allocation of scientists to problems from the point of view of society as a whole.
Oh, so it's a good thing.
It's a good thing, yeah. And it makes scientists it makes scientists into often into individuals who behave somewhat unpleasantly. The sociologist Robert Merton got really interested in this because he was interested in how vehement priority disputes can be. And scientists are arguing with one another about who was first. So that's a real price of the system, that these arguments become relevant because so much is at stake. It's a winner-takes-all system. And that looks like something that is possibly a waste of energy and time.
Sure.
In fact, there are proposals, if you look around, to reform the system, make it somewhat friendlier and less of a winner-takes-all thing. Mm-hmm. But my idea was to look at the effects of the winner-takes-all system on what decisions scientists make when they're wondering what they should be doing
to work on,
time in their research grants and so on. And to make an argument that there's actually a positive effect here, that it's a somewhat subtle effect, but there'll be a shift in the way they spread themselves out that actually will turn out to be more beneficial, and more beneficial because there's a kind of symmetry going on here, because scientific discoveries have a kind of what I call in this paper a winner contributes all payoff situation, where they only need to be made once for society to extract the maximum benefit. Okay? So once you've figured out how to create a certain, say, polio vaccine, there's no additional benefit to having some other group in some other part of the world produce exactly the same vaccine. Different vaccine might have some benefit, but to produce exactly the same vaccine is useless.
Yeah.
And so it turns out there's actually an interesting connection between that feature of scientific knowledge, that it's the kind of product where one item of each type is enough, and that the utility of a reward scheme where only the first to produce it get rewarded.
And do you have any particular case studies with which you examined this, or?
Well, it's not the method is not so much case studies, but a kind of large-scale abstract mathematical modeling.
Oh.
So it's all done with proofs, more or less.
Oh, okay.
Actually, pretty simple stuff, but But the idea is to set up the situation using some simple mathematical models and then show that, given those models, the priority system will result in something closer to an optimal allocation of labor than any of its plausible rivals.
Huh. Wow. And has this been work that you've been working on and you continue to do, or is this, sort of something that was around in the 2000s to 2010 range?
I have been. I've continued to think about these kinds of issues. So my most recent work on this is about a different behavior of scientists that Robert Merton, the sociologist, also found very interesting, which is the feeling they have that they ought to share everything they know with their fellow scientists.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think Merton was right that there is a felt obligation to share. And this creates an interesting problem for scientists in the light of the priority rule, because, sometimes sharing is no problem. Sometimes sharing is just showing off what you've done and getting rewarded for it.
Sure.
But scientists also feel obliged to share research in progress, how this technique is shaping up, whether this is working out, what results they've gotten so far. And that kind of sharing can actually lead to their other scientists working on similar questions getting there first, getting credit. And there's been some sociological research on this which suggests that this happens quite a lot.
Yeah.
So I think in one big study, something like 30% of scientists said that it had happened to them. They'd shared something with colleagues, and those colleagues had used what they'd shared to publish results that the sharers were originally hoping to publish themselves. So they hadn't yet achieved those results. And their colleagues ended up getting there first, and so they lost out.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in a big way, but in a way. So you'd think, given that there would be no sharing whatsoever.
Right.
But clearly there is some sharing, because people are, at least some of the time.
Do you think I don't know. Do you think it's it's hard to maybe answer this. Is it as a result of obligation, or is it just as a result of, in some ways, sometimes sharing depends on the nature of the sharing, but I don't know. I've heard stories where you're at a meeting. Let's say it's not, you're kind of at a specialized meeting and you're sharing some particular work that you're kind of coming, or maybe you've written a sort of an sort of a paper in its infancy on, and then you're sharing with the hope of either further developing or just helping out your fellow colleagues in some kind of a way.
It might be that it's just generally altruistic.
Okay. Yeah.
But I think not, because it seems that the scientists feel obliged. Of course, they don't always follow through on these obligations any more than regular people, but they feel obliged to share information in a way that they don't, for example, feel obliged to, say, share their equipment.
Right.
So if you ask them, can I just come in and spend the week doing some experiments on your setup while you cool your heels?
Yeah.
You might, if you're feeling very altruistic, say yes, but you don't feel like you would be. It would be unreasonable to say no.
Yeah, sure.
In fact, it seems like
more reasonable to say no.
Request, right?
Yeah.
What do you mean? It's my equipment.
yeah. This is time, money.
But when it comes to information,
that's really interesting.
Things get a little bit more complicated. Yes, it's my information, and yet I feel like there's some obligation on me to let you in on what's going on. So I was interested in understanding why it is even possible to set things up so a sharing norm like this would exist in science.
Huh. Very interesting. And have you found? Yeah. So, have you reached any conclusions as to the?
Yes, I have a paper on this that just came out.
Oh, great!
All this stuff is on my website, where I argue, again, using this technique of creating mathematical models, and in effect, and showing that through mathematical derivation, basically, that the models have certain properties that in a sharing regime where everybody shares everything, you can expect that on the whole your situation is going to be a fair one, in the sense that you'll benefit about as much from what other people share with you as other people will benefit from having you share what you have. So you'll neither benefit inordinately or lose out inordinately on average.
Yeah.
Now that's just. I mean, some people will lose out maybe, and some people will benefit inordinately. But going in, even if you knowing already what information you have, so it's not from behind a veil of ignorance. Knowing what you have, your estimate should be that you'll come out about even. If you just enter into a kind of share and share alike agreement with everyone else in your field. So it's not unreasonable to enter into an agreement like that.
Yeah.
It's not, for example, that larger or better funded research programs can reasonably expect to come out ahead, and smaller ones can reasonably expect to come out behind. If that were the case, then of course the smaller ones
would never
wouldn't want
share.
to enter into it.
Yeah.
Or vice versa. But since everyone can expect for things to be more or less fair, and also I should add, everyone can expect also to benefit somewhat, in the sense that the results of getting nowhere, the chance of getting nowhere will decrease. They ought to be positively disposed to entering into a sharing agreement like this.
Huh. Oh.
Now, a sharing agreement still would require some kind of policing, right? Like, so you ought to want to enter into the agreement, but you also only under the condition that the sharing is policed, so that free riders don't take advantage of your own generosity.
Yeah.
But something like the sharing norm is at least the beginnings of that kind of enforcement.
Yeah.
It's an interesting situation where somehow or other, now in this paper I have a few throwaway comments, but I don't make any positive claim. Somehow or other, science has hit upon the fact that this is a generally beneficial way of setting up setting up information exchanges. That is, setting up so that they're in effect share and share alike operations.
Yeah. No, that's great. I mean, and then I suppose, and the kind of sharing you're referring to is not necessarily at conferences. That's one kind of sharing, but it's more in this informal kind of meeting and discussion, very openly amongst colleagues, friends, through email exchanges, through those kinds of things. Yeah,
often people will specifically request something. They'll say, can you show me how to make this piece of apparatus work? Or can I take a look at your raw data in this particular study?
Gotcha. Okay, great.
And that's when those kinds of requests, scientists feel somewhat obliged to respond positively to.
Yeah.
It seems that typically what happens is if they don't want to do it, then rather than simply flatly refusing, they find a way to comply in a less than helpful way. They're embarrassed. They're embarrassed not to do it in a way that, say, you wouldn't be embarrassed if somebody just came up to you and said, "Can I have your wallet?" It's not embarrassing to say no. Or can I have your experimental apparatus? No.
Yeah.
But it is now embarrassing to say no. You can't look at my raw data.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, I know. Yeah. So I see this is the scientific sharing, communism and the social contract. Is this the
That's right.
paper?
So Merton referred to the norm as the communist norm.
Yeah.
And it is a certain limited kind of communism, in the sense that this information is treated as though it's everyone's property.
Right.
Although it's probably better to think of it as, well, no, I don't know actually. Quite how to think of it.
But there's a way, but there's a way in which you can maintain this sort of sharing while still giving appreciation to the priority rule. Or at least that's the hope.
Yeah, well, I mean, so the priority rule still holds. So on the one hand, you feel obliged to share, and on the other hand, you know that if you do share, then you're increasing your chances of losing out under the regime priority rule. And that's quite a tense and difficult situation for scientists to be in.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to, if you take these two pieces of work together, they're explaining why science is nevertheless set up that way.
Yeah, great. Well, in the interest of time, I said, if it's okay with you, I'd like to chat. Just ask you once more, maybe return to your new book that will be coming out this fall, and then follow up with that difficult, challenging question I asked at the beginning. But yeah, so the book, Thinking Off Your Feet: How Empirical Psychology Vindicates Armchair Philosophy. I have this description here of trying to ask what's going on under the hood in philosophical analysis. So what do you try and as I mentioned, I'd seen your excellent explanation of or sort of critique of Edouard Moschery's book, Philosophy Within Its Proper Bounds. So in what way is this book either responding to that book, or it's not necessarily a response, but how does it connect with that particular book, and what are you trying to say?
Well, it does. It does respond to that book.
Okay.
And I mean, more generally, it responds to the arguments of the negative experimental philosophers.
Right.
And some other related arguments. Starting from a place that the experimental philosophers also start from. So the importance of
and what is
the psychology of philosophy.
Right. And what is the negative? Yeah. So could you characterize the negative project for us of those experiments?
Well, let me say something. A couple of specific things. Here's a couple of specific concerns that the negative experimental philosophers have. The first is the one that has gotten the most attention from them. This is a concern that our the thoughts we have in the armchair, and in particular case judgments about things like Gettier cases and the philosophy of knowledge, and so on. There are reactions to these thought experiments. People sometimes call them intuitions. The worry is that those are unreliable.
Right.
And so there are various arguments to the effect that they're unreliable. Another worry is that the whole subject matter is in some sense insubstantial. That what we're doing when we investigate the nature of knowledge is we're really doing the anthropology of some very specific human concept. Maybe not just human, maybe just Western European.
Sure.
So it may be ethnographically exciting to answer the question, what is it for somebody to know something? But you shouldn't think that you're looking into the eternal verities.
Is it sort of like, it's kind of like with science's weird problem? Have you heard of this? Is it kind of similar? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the weird worry impacts on both of these problems. Right. I think.
Yeah.
Anyway, what I'm trying to do with the book is diffuse some of these worries. So on the one hand, to make a case that at least some of the judgments, some of the time when they really matter, are in fact reliable. What I'm doing in order to argue this is looking into where they come from more carefully, looking into the psychology and looking into the concepts, like the concept of knowledge that are involved in making them. And also why we should expect, whatever the origin of those concepts, why the answers are interesting in a way that's not just anthropological. So a good chunk of the book is directed against those concerns of the experimental philosophers by making a positive case for the reliability of these case judgments and the interest of the whole project of answering questions like what is knowledge based on making these case judgments.
Yeah. And so, I see in the description you describe, you try to understand philosophical analysis in terms of inductive analysis. How is this, and so what kind of work is this kind of understanding providing, this new characterization?
Well, I think one important strand of it is the idea that what we're doing when we make judgments about, say, what counts as knowledge is we're applying a theory of knowledge, not a definition of knowledge, but a theory of knowledge.
Okay.
Which is somewhat like an empirical theory. It's not necessarily an empirical theory, but it's like a scientific theory in the sense it's a bunch of hypotheses. These hypotheses can change. We can change our minds about them.
Mm-hmm.
It's that sets up the basic context for tackling both of these questions. One is, are the judgments based on a theory like that reliable, and are they interesting?
Yeah.
So maybe I shouldn't monologue on too much about exactly what answers I give, but that idea, what people call the theory of concepts, is the framework within which I'm trying to answer these questions.
Okay. Great. And so, how do you think I suppose we won't know until the fall, but how do you think the experimental philosophers will respond?
I hope that...
or I imagine you've talked with...
find my methods congenial.
Okay.
And that I'll get some good feedback. I assume some respectful disagreement, but a lot of engagement.
Yeah.
I don't pretend to have the complete story in my book, so I think it's an ongoing project to look into as I call it, the psychology of philosophy. But it's something I think the experimental philosophers have cast a lot of light on.
Yeah.
So I hope there is constructive engagement, as well as a lot of entertaining and vociferous argument.
Yeah. Well, so if we were to accept the claims in this book, I mean, what do you there might be some normative implications in terms of how to do philosophy or how to do this kind of philosophy. So what do you think might result? Or what, if you were to take these claims at face value, or, accept these claims, how might you, go about your projects?
Well, in a way, my conclusion is very conservative. It's armchair philosophers just keep on
doing the thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's, so in that sense, there's no need for philosophers to change. Of course, the book itself is not armchair philosophy. It's based on empirical psychology. So it's an example. It sets an example, which takes philosophers out of the armchair. It's not as if I think that only armchair philosophy is good, obviously.
Yeah, of course.
So there's a sense in which it's also supposed to be there's a case there for being an empirical thinker, for being an empirical psychologist, as well as a philosopher.
Right.
I think it's okay for the armchair philosophers to keep on doing what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, does it carve out a particular space with which with which one should or is more? It is, in terms of the kinds of questions one should work on that the armchair philosophy is of particular interest to do, or does it help to define those? Or
I think to some extent, yes, but the conclusions are not surprising. I think philosophers are one of the things that we can figure out in the armchair is what kinds of questions we need to consult the world on.
Right.
Up to a point. I mean, of course, these are not things about which there's complete agreement.
Sure.
But it's not I'm afraid, it's not a revisionary view in that respect. So we know if we want to understand the nature of space, we should pay some attention to what the physicists are up to.
Right.
For example.
Yep.
At the very least, it would be helpful.
Yep.
Well, most of us think that.
For a naturalized metaphysics approach.
I mean, a part of what I'm doing in the book, you could see, is giving a story where the two streams, the armchair stream and the empirical learning about the world, come together in a kind of natural way, and are integrated without any kind of methodological awkwardness.
Oh, that sounds.
So there's a story there about how scientific thinking and philosophical thinking can easily be united.
Mm. And whereas, and I suppose, approaches like Edouard's are more of how philosophical thinking needs to change in some kind of a way. Would that be fair? Yeah. Or at least how current maybe that's one conclusion one could lead, or that this kind of thinking is not, it's a more of a negative program than
and even more radically than that we should just abandon some kinds of questions. They're not really interesting questions to answer.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm excited to hear from your hopefully an author meets critics moment, if that's hosted, and to see how that goes. Great. Well, let's conclude with the question I've been asking my guests. Michael, tell me, what do you think to be the most challenging problem facing philosophers of science today?
Yes, I would have been thinking about that all through the interview if you hadn't been asking me these other questions.
That's okay. Either a problem for philosophers, individuals, or for the field, perhaps a favorite question or something.
I suppose one challenge that philosophers of science ought to be in a good position to rise to, but which as yet they haven't on the whole risen to, is entering into the wider debates that are going on about science right now. I should say immediately, I know some philosophers of science who are very much involved in these debates.
Sure.
But I think philosophy of science as a discipline is still not being heard as a major player, as a major voice in these debates. So I'm thinking about things as diverse as first the ongoing struggles about the teaching of creationism in U.S. schools. Mm-hmm. More recently, concerns about replication, about the triviality of a lot of scientific research, due to the fact it's too easy with big data techniques to find statistically significant connections, publish them and move on, connected to replicability, but the concern, even if these connections are in some sense real. These ways in which the changing nature of the tools available to scientists are perhaps undermining some of the assumptions, or undermining some of the assumptions that have made the way science has been done so far good ways to do it. Some people. Another area is the discussion that's gone on about whether given the rigors and stresses of the modern scientific career, whether the priority rule is the downside of the priority rule is growing too great. Whether it's just not worth it anymore to have the priority rule that's causing too many problems. So these kinds of questions that scientists as a whole are wrestling with are questions about which I think philosophers of science are really in a position to give good answers, but scientists are not on the whole thinking, gosh, we need to ask a philosopher.
Yeah, sure.
So we need to make a case that we should be a part of the conversation.
Yeah, and perhaps,
we really have something to offer. Our style of thinking really has something to offer.
Well, this makes me think in terms of, for example, I could just ask, before I maybe mention other examples, have you yourself found yourself wanting to participate in these debates at all, or have in the past?
I would like to. I haven't quite sort of found the time and the energy to do it in more than a very small scale way, though.
Well, in what there's no reward structure often for participating in these kinds of things.
Maybe that's a part of the problem. Although I think in philosophy we have a much more flexible reward structure than in science.
That's true. You can kind of, as long as you're doing good work on anything, you pretty much have to,
Yeah, I mean, there's a general problem with academia not giving enough weight to work that people do in the wider world. Although possibly that is made up for by the reward of recognition from the wider world. Sure. That you get from doing that kind of work that you certainly don't get for publishing some monograph.
Right.
That's read by 100 people.
Yeah.
So I don't know that the reward system
might not be. That's just the problem here. Picture. Yeah.
But it may just be we don't quite have the institutions for it yet.
Yeah.
It's not enough. One person can speak out as somebody with interesting views, but that's not enough for people to. And then people have done this, but it's not enough for people to start to think. Yeah, this is a problem for the philosophers of science. I wonder what they think.
Right. Good. All right. Well, Michael, thank you so much for chatting with us. Going on for thanks for hanging out for a couple hours, and it was great to hear your story. Thank you for talking so much about your hometown in New Zealand, what it was like growing up, and the number of your excellent works. And we didn't even get to ask. I mean, obviously, this book is coming out in the fall. Do you have anything, sort of in the future, or things that you're kind of looking toward working on?
Oh yeah, I have a whole other project in the works actually about a couple of things. One is, I'll just mention them because then.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
I will have said enough. A project on the nature of understanding.
Oh, okay.
Come out of my work on explanation, but opening up the work on explanation and understanding in areas other than science, and also a project which is speaking of talking to people more generally, a project which is writing a more popular book, a trade book about the nature of science.
Oh.
About why science is so successful and why it took so long to figure out how to do it right.
Huh. Oh, this is great.
It's kind of a traditional philosophy of science topic in a way, although one that hasn't been discussed as much recently as it was in the days of Popper and Kuhn and so on.
Right. Well, I'll be looking forward. I mean, both projects sound very interesting. And, be looking forward to both of them. All right. Well, all right, Michael. Well, enjoy the rest of the spring day. Hopefully, I didn't keep you inside too long. But like I said, enjoy the remainder. Is the semester wrapped up? Are we almost done?
The semester is over, and when I say goodbye, I'm going to head off to our department's end of year party.
Oh, okay. I've heard some chittering. Yeah, some chattering. All right. Well, I won't keep you any longer. Enjoy the party, and we'll be in touch soon.
Okay, fantastic. Great.
Take care.
Bye.